Colonel Macgregor, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
So, sir, one of the hot topics right about now is the war in Ukraine, and I would just like to maybe get your sense on how it started and where we are right now.
Well, that's a loaded question. That could go on for hours.
Yeah.
I think most people just need to understand that this war shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. And it certainly was no surprise to the people in Washington who seem to have been anxious to start it. You go back to the 1990s when promises were made that we would not exploit the collapse of the Soviet state system to advance NATO into Eastern Europe. In other words, we would not move further east. And there, at the time, I was in Europe, and many of us thought, well, there's no enemy. That's over. The Soviet forces have withdrawn, and why don't we go home? Of course, that was the last thing that anybody in Washington, D.C., as far as we can tell, wanted, and probably also in London, and presumably, I guess, in Ottawa. Unfortunately, we saw this as an imperial structure that we wanted to maintain so that we could use Europe for all sorts of other purposes, primarily as a platform to project power elsewhere in the world. And we saw that happen very early in the Balkans, where we pursued this sort of liberal hegemony by, at least in theory, imposing liberal democracy on the unhappy people of the Balkans. And we see how well that's turned out. That's certainly a place of instability that's likely to last as long as we interfere in it. And then by 2008, it became clear that we were going to advance NATO into Ukraine, also Georgia. Your audience is familiar with what happened in Georgia. And the Ukrainian issue was of infinitely greater importance, frankly, than Georgia, because Ukraine, what happens there is a matter of existential importance to the Russians. It always has been. And they were watching carefully what was happening in Ukraine. And then suddenly, as Ukraine became more and more for Russia, certainly difficult for the Russians who live inside Ukraine, then there was the coup in 2014, and almost immediately a war began between Ukraine and the so-called breakaway oblasts or provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. And the Russians in Ukraine have been living as second-class, some would say third-class citizens, having to submit to Ukrainianization in terms of language, culture, identity, even in the church that they attend. And the violation of Russian rights became a matter of great concern to Putin and his government. That was one of the reasons for the Minsk Accords. And at the same time, they were watching what was, in their minds, the unambiguous militarization of Ukraine as a NATO satellite with the goal of ultimately attacking Russia. And one of the reasons that the Russians moved very quickly and suddenly into Crimea was not simply because it had always been part of Russia. When I say always, I go back to 1776, certainly as long as the United States has existed, but more important because they saw Crimea and the naval bases on it potentially becoming a NATO outpost. They saw the anchoring there along with the Royal Navy and other forces. And the Black Sea, of course, is another very sensitive matter. It's sensitive to the Turks, it's sensitive to the Russians, the Bulgarians, and others. Finally, it became clear that things were coming to a head, that there was a vast buildup of military power in the eastern part of Ukraine. The Russians actually captured plans once they intervened, suggesting that the Ukrainians were planning on attacks not only to regain control of Luhansk and Donetsk, which had effectively made themselves autonomous because they wanted to be Russians, but also Crimea. And ergo, you get a war. But this was something that didn't have to happen because they were really willing to negotiate. They wanted to revisit all of the agreements that they thought were meaningful and turned out to be irrelevant. Everything from START to the INF Treaty and also to the old convention agreements that said that we would not move high-end conventional forces into Eastern Europe. All of this was rejected. In fact, I would say any recommendation from Moscow was treated with complete contempt. And so we have a war. And the war began very slowly because the Russians mistakenly thought that if they demonstrated that they were serious by only intervening in the far eastern part of the country with roughly 90,000 troops out of the 190,000 that they'd assembled, that they would have a negotiating partner. Well, they did have some negotiations in March and early April. And suddenly those negotiations collapsed as soon as Mr. Zelensky and his representatives indicated there would be a willingness on Ukraine's part to adopt neutrality. And you'll remember that Boris Johnson, the former prime minister, flew in to Kiev and made it abundantly clear that that was unacceptable to NATO. And promises were made, elaborate promises of infinite aid, assistance, and support from all of the NATO nations that would make Ukraine effectively an extension of NATO. And we would stay with Ukraine until the bitter end. And after all, Russia was weak. Russia was still the backward, effectively demilitarized state it was in the 1990s. It could be bullied. So stay the course with us. You'll win. We'll triumph. And this is part of the liberal, democratic, globalist revolution that's going to sweep all the way to the Urals. By the way, I heard that nonsense in 1999 before the bombing in Kosovo began. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, where are we today? Well, today there are roughly 750,000 Russian troops in and around Ukraine. The southern portion of the country, which is heavily Russian in terms of population, history, and so forth, has been successfully defended now for, 6-8 months against numerous offensives and counterattacks designed to drive the Russians out. Now, why did the Russians opt in the fall of last year for a defensive posture? Well, precisely because they recognized the force they'd sent in was too small for the job. They didn't even understand the job when they went in there. Now they know they've got to crush the Ukrainian armed forces out of existence for all intents and purposes. And they have to compel the Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table. They realize that may take everything from another month to another 2 years, depending upon how far and how fast they want to move. We keep telling them that nothing's acceptable until they agree to commit suicide publicly, pull out of eastern Ukraine, and beg for forgiveness. Well, since that's not going to happen, the Russians are continuing to quietly mobilize more reserves, goal of ultimately building a force of 1.2 million. That force would ultimately go all the way to the Polish border. But I think for the moment, what they're looking at in August and September is now going over to the offensive. And in fact, that's already begun in the northeastern portion of Ukraine, along an axis that reaches from Belgrade in Russia all the way to Limon and Slavyansk, and potentially could end up with the encirclement of Kharkov, at which point in time, I suppose the Russians will invite the Ukrainians to hurl their final reserves at them in the defensive positions around Kharkov, which will result in their annihilation. And then at some point, Russia will cross the river and take Odessa. And again, they will pause and they will wait to see if there's anyone willing to talk with them. And if there isn't, well, then they'll continue to move. Everything is very deliberate. This is not a rushed operation by any means. They move within the framework of their integrated air defenses, which effectively neutralize air power and protect their forces from the range of missiles and drones and rockets that are out there. And then you also have the necessity of moving their strike systems, their ground-based strike systems, further forward as their troops advance. This all takes time, so it's a very deliberate operation, very carefully planned and executed. And thus far, it's proven to be unstoppable by the Ukrainians. And I think we're seeing that right now with this offensive.
And the narrative that we seem to be getting here in Canada, for the most part, is that of an unprovoked invasion of aggression on the part of Vladimir Putin. And if you were to ask the average Canadian on the street, they would tell you that what really needs to happen is Putin needs to be assassinated, or, like Biden has said, regime change in Russia. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, this is the sort of unrealistic insanity that seems to drive the globalist elites that are ruling the Western world today, whether it's your country, my country, France, Germany, Scandinavia. All of the globalists operate in a world that is, I would call, a dangerous fantasy. It's a world in which everything is black and white. Anything that is different from what they want is unacceptable. And what do they want? They into some sort of imitation of what they've done to Western Europe, to the United States and Canada. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, you eradicate borders and you allow anyone from anywhere to enter at any given point in time. You reject the notion that religion, language, culture, ethnicity, race mean anything. You say, no, they're all meaningless. All human beings are fungible. Everything's equally meaningless, if you will. It's a nice view of the world that says, human beings don't matter. They can be forged into something else. This is the old Soviet mantra from the 20s and the 30s, where the Bolsheviks talked about creating a new of Soviet men and women who had no identities, no backgrounds, no self-consciousness, no self-awareness, who would then labor happily in the massive factories and collective farms created by the Bolsheviks that well, it's all nonsense. It all fell apart on its own. That's effectively what the so-called globalists are telling you. That's the reset. Mm-hmm. That's Mr. Trudeau. That's President Biden. We could go down the list. They all sing from the same ridiculous tune. It's failing miserably. And the Russians have said, no, wait a minute. We're Russians. This is a Russian Orthodox state. We have a history that reaches back 1,000 years. We are not prepared to go out of business because you've decided that this is irrelevant. We're not going to take in tens of millions of people who are radically different from us, who will never be Russians, who will not swear allegiance to the Russian state, who will not be true and faithful to us. We're not going to do that. Now, you can live in Russia as a Muslim Turk. The Chechens do it, but they are loyal to the Russian state. They are part of the Russian state. They are treated equally as Russian citizens before the law. So we know that this is not an ethnically pure state in the sense that the globalists describe it. Far from it. But the point is that there is a clear, unambiguous law that says, this is who we are. This is what we speak. This is our culture. These are our laws. Obey these, assimilate to these, and you are welcome. We've jettisoned all of that in the West. Inside the United States, we're not even enforcing the law in most cases in our cities, along our borders. We've dismantled our country for all intents and purposes. And Americans are standing around figuring out this is a catastrophe, and they're beginning to wonder whether or not our country will survive at all. We're getting to that tipping point where the population decides what it will and will not tolerate anymore. That, of course, is scary to the elites in Washington. And so they're trying desperately to maintain the economic stability in the financial system, because if you can sedate the population with lots of cash, easy income, good standard of living, well, chances are they'll go back to sleep and let you do pretty much whatever you do in Washington. But that, too, isn't working too well. It's not just inflation. It's because we have these trillion-dollar debts that we can never possibly pay off. And the people that have been telling us for years debt doesn't matter are beginning to be on increasingly shaky ground. One wonders when the fire sale on our U.S. treasuries begins. We don't know, but it's probably coming. When that happens, all hell is going to break loose inside our financial system. But what you hear from people is, oh, yes, there are bad things that could happen, but not for at least 5 or 10 years. And, of course, that's the hope of the left, because in 5 or 10 years, they figure there'll be enough non-citizens, non-Americans inside the United States, it won't matter anymore. We will cease to exist as a nation. And I think this is the thing that Putin watches and says, no, we're not going to do it. So they're fighting back. But he has powerful opponents. And the opponents are very well known. People like Soros and Schwab and others, massive funds at their disposal that are being used to install the globalist elites in power. So that's it in a nutshell. This war then is also, for the Russians, existential. They are not prepared to see their government destroyed. They're not prepared to see their government and their population, their nation dismembered, and to be stripped of its resources and effectively sold on the chopping block or the slave auction which is what it amounts to. So I think this war is going to go on until it can't, and it won't go on beyond the point where we can afford to do it. And that's a real question. How much more can we afford to waste on this proposition? How much more risk do we want to take with our own military power? Because, as you know, we're having enormous trouble trying to recruit for our armed forces, because the same that the globalists want to inject into Russia is destroying our armed forces, destroying the national identity, destroying our national cohesion, and destroying our national military power.
Yeah, we seem to be having a lot of the same problems up here north of the 49. Our own duplicitous Kendall of a prime minister referred to Canada as the world's first post-nation state when he first got elected. And there's a lot of this wokeness in our military now, where we seem to be having an issue, a major issue, retaining troops as well as recruiting. Could you speak to perhaps the impacts of wokeness, as I know is being inflicted on your own military?
Well, there are two things that need to be mentioned. And we were talking before this began, and you were telling me that you'd served in the fun and sunspots that we all know so well, Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, you've got millions of people now who served in the armed forces over the last 30 years in various places. And they've come and they've gone. And those that are on the outside have concluded, look, this doesn't make a lot of sense. You tell an American soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine who arrives in Kabul or Baghdad that he's here to help build some new utopian society on the foundations of these desert countries, for all intents and purposes. And in about 10 minutes, he looks around and says, you're out of your mind. There's nothing happening here. Nothing will happen here. And then this is something else, especially the soldier or Marine does when he figures out, well, I can get killed here. He says, look, I'm not going to die for this place. This is crazy. So the soldier and the Marine does something that we don't want him to do when he goes into action, and that is think first and foremost about his own life. Because if you're going to be a good soldier, you have to go into action with a goal of killing the enemy. And of course, you know the best way to stay alive in battle is to kill the enemy before he gets a shot at you. You don't want him thinking about, well, this is ridiculous. There's no point in being here, so I'm going to make damn sure I don't get killed. That's detrimental to everything that we preach in military affairs. So that's problem number one. Lots of people have said we've been misinformed, lied to, or betrayed. Secondly, now you're telling us that 17-year-old or 18-year-old Susie, all of 110 pounds over there, can do anything I as a man can do. And I weigh 190, I'm 5'11" or 6 feet tall. And I know that's not true, that there are no differences between her and me, that we're the same. Well, that just isn't true. It's not true emotionally. It's not true physiologically. It's not true biologically. That's nonsense. And now you're being told, well, in addition to gender being a so-called artificial construct, not being real, which is pure Marxist nonsense. In addition to that, now you're being told, well, you know, you could become a woman, you could become a man, or you could become something else. And now we want to create categories for multiple genders, depending upon what an individual decides he, she, or it wants to be tomorrow morning. All of this is irrelevant in military affairs, because ultimately all military establishments exist for the same purpose: to kill the enemies of their respective nation states. That's why we exist. There is no other reason for us to be. We are not there to nation build. We're not there to build dams and roads. We're not there to suppress riots internal to our society. Now, we can do those things. That's very true. And we can do many of those things very well for a limited period. But our preeminent purpose for existence is what I said before: to kill the enemies of our respective nation states. Now, we've lost sight of that. That's the easiest thing I can say. And part of it is because of the illusion of power we created for ourselves by effectively dominating weak opponents with firepower. Afghans, Iraqis, even the most formidable opponent that we have faced, to be blunt, were the Serbs. But we never went in on the ground against them. We sat in splendid isolation and hurled precision-guided munitions and bombs at them until finally they faced the very, very real prospect of starvation and freezing in the winter because the Russians pulled the rug out from under them and said, we can't afford to support you anymore. We have our own problems. And so they lost. But my point is that everybody else that we've dealt with was weak. And that's not a measure of your military effectiveness. So today, I would argue that you and we and the French and the British and many other West Europeans, less so in the case in Eastern Europe, but all of us have this sort of erroneous view of ourselves as a formidable military establishment because we haven't fought anybody who can really fight back. That's kind of where we were before World War I. And I would argue that was kind of where we were in the 1930s before World War II. This notion of the colonial military experience as being a good metric for measuring our military capability. It isn't. It never was. And here are the Russians who have not been engaged in any of those things. You know, we have 800 bases around the world. The Russians have one outside of Russia. I think the Chinese have one outside of China. So as a result, they're focused on what I call wars of decision launched from their soil. They're going to defend themselves, and they're going to defend themselves decisively with decisive military power. That's what you're seeing emerge now in Russia. And Russia is now more powerful, more formidable, more capable than it was in the 1980s.
And you mentioned the affordability aspect of it when you referenced Russia's support for the Serbs. And that seems to be becoming a question for Western militaries now as well, and in particular the United States. We just saw them send cluster munitions to the Ukrainians. Now, when it was Jen Psaki who was the press secretary, that was a war crime. But now that it's Cringe Jean-Pierre, it seems that it's not. So, yeah. And why all of a sudden the 180 on that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we're running out of conventional artillery ammunition. In fact, I would argue we're running out of a lot of things. And more important, we're rediscovering something many people warned about in the 1990s after 1991, and that is that our military industrial power has no surge capacity. In other words, we can't turn to any of the big five defensive firms and tell them, I now want to be able to produce 1,000 of X every month, or 2,000, or 10,000, whatever it happens to be. Everything from boots to missiles. And right now, the precision-guided munitions and missiles require very careful construction. These are not things that just roll off the assembly line a la World War II. There are lots of people running around the table installing chips and installing pieces and parts of precision-guided mechanisms that go into missiles. Takes time. And you don't have the numerous, what's the right word, subcontractors that we used to have. We used to have numerous firms that specialized in certain areas. We destroyed all of that in the 1990s, late 90s, and grouped everything under the massive power and control of just 5 defensive firms. They have all become very oriented, unsurprisingly, on massive profits. They want to make lots and lots of money. So they're not in the business of maintaining capabilities that could be useful in a crisis. In other words, everything's being cut to the bone to maximize profit. All of a sudden, we're dealing with a very different opponent. And I don't particularly care to call the Russians an enemy because I do not see them that way. This is not the Soviet Union. Whatever Russia's faults or flaws or problems may be, they're not an evil empire. And they are not pushing to install their view of the world anywhere else. And I get so tired of it because, if anything, you know, we are people living in a big glass house. And what we have is hardly perfection or utopia. I'm not saying, well, America or Canada are bad. That's not my point. My point is that we've been hypocrites for far too long. And that's part of the cluster bomb effect. It's not just we're running out of ammunition, so we'll send them whatever we've got. But any time we've taken a stand that we alleged was moral, what's happened? We've abandoned it. We've established multiple red lines, and when those are crossed, we walk back and establish another new red line. Everything is an exercise in hypocrisy. And I think this hypocritical approach is going to be exposed here in the months that lie ahead, because the Russians are not playing those games. The Russians are in this to win. For them, it's life or death. For us, this is treated in the United States as almost a hobby. Look, there are no American soldiers about to enter Ukraine. And every time that comes up for discussion, we listen to Mr. Biden say, oh, no, that won't happen. Now, for those of us that lived through the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson, who promised everybody in 1965, I will not send any American boys over to fight in a place called Vietnam when Vietnamese boys ought to be doing the fighting. And what happened? FDR said, I will not send American boys to Europe to die in another European war. What happened? So we're suspicious, but I think as badly misguided and corrupt as this current government is, they're still smart enough to understand that's the path to total destruction. Drag us into a direct confrontation with Russia. The American people will never support it, and we can't sustain it.
Yeah, and you mentioned a little bit about there, the United States in particular is pretty much running out of ammunition, and we have the same problem here in Canada as well. We've sent all kinds of munitions over there to Ukraine. There's no talk about committing troops or anything like that. A lot of it is in the periphery. Like, we'll send folks to Latvia, which I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin is going to interpret as another chessboard or another piece on the chessboard moving into place. Probably doesn't send the right signal. But at the same time, concurrent to that, we have China doing a lot of exercises around a Taiwan invasion. So is the West, the United States, even in a position to defend Taiwan if something like that were to go down?
No. First of all, the Chinese are not massing 1 million men to invade Taiwan. That's not happening. What's happening is as follows. We are the ones that keep insisting on sailing battle groups, naval battle groups, through the Taiwan Strait between the mainland China and Taiwan. We insist, well, these are open waters, this is international waters and so forth. But strictly speaking, if you go back and look at the law, international law, which we usually treat with complete disinterest, it, in fact, talks about the proximity of something like Taiwan, that kind of landmass, to another landmass as being different from the open ocean. And it can be interpreted as a threatening act militarily towards China. And indeed, I would argue that's what it is. We sail up and down there with the obvious goal of provoking China. Well, we're successful. I keep waiting for the Chinese to sail all sorts of things up and down the West Coast of the United States, or more important, perhaps the Russians and the Chinese and anybody else who wants to join them sail into the Caribbean. I can only imagine what we would do if a force like our carrier battle group sailed between Florida and Cuba. I mean, we would go crazy. The American people would be furious. What are they doing out there? Now, of course, they can't see submarines, and there are Russian missile boats off our shores. Now, you don't have to get very close to the United States today in order to launch a missile against us. Technology has advanced. But those things are definitely out there. And Americans don't seem to understand that if we provoke a war with China or Russia, that war will reach us. We're not going to sit here in splendid isolation while everybody else is consumed with destruction. That destruction will visit us. We also don't understand that the Russians in particular, they can escalate horizontally. They can create trouble for us on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is far closer and always has been to Moscow than to Beijing. To be frank with you, the Chinese find North Korea reprehensible. It's more than just an irritant. They see it as dangerous. That's one of the reasons why President Trump's initiative to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula could have succeeded had he signed the document. It's also why we can ultimately get out of South Korea. But this administration doesn't want to do that. But they fail to understand that they're at risk now in ways that no one has even seen. What about Russian influence in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Mexico, in Nicaragua? We're very vulnerable. We don't even guard our borders. We don't know how many thousands of people have come into the country who are actually foreign agents who could interfere with or disrupt our nuclear power plants. That would be a nightmare on steroids. Look at how the world is up in arms at the possibility that the Ukrainians might try to cause a nuclear accident at the plant in Zaporizhzhia. Now imagine something bad happening inside the United States because foreign agents caused it to happen. Americans aren't thinking about it because Americans aren't interested, in most cases, in what happens beyond the borders of their country. The bad news is that when you treat what happens overseas with sort of only casual indifference, you have a group of people in Washington who love manipulating and love exploiting our power for agendas that have nothing to do with American interests. And there is no American interest in a war with Russia over eastern Ukraine. None.
Yeah, and on that, the subject of the border issue and potential foreign agents within the United States, we seem to be having a lot of issues up here as well when it comes to swaths of fighting-age males immigrating to the country. We're watching as closely as anybody can these days what happened with France. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into what's going on in France right now.
Well, you know, I have a great deal of affection for the French and the French military. And I think most of us in the Western world, Germans, Austrians, Danes, Dutch, Spaniards, everyone still reveres French civilization and culture as one of the highest achievements of Western civilization. And so I'm personally very concerned because what you have is something that was described many years ago in a book called Camp of the Saints. It's a situation in which people that you thought you were supposed to try and assimilate have really come to assimilate you. And so suddenly the French are fighting a very dangerous battle inside their own country for their survival as a people, as a culture, as a nation. I hope they can win that battle. And this happens when tolerance goes too far. When tolerance becomes the intolerable, you're on the path to total destruction. We are tolerating the intolerable in our cities. In 2020, we tolerated the intolerable, ostensibly because of this George Floyd business. Nobody pointed to the obvious truth that George Floyd was a repeat offender who'd gone to jail as a violent criminal and who had enough fentanyl in him at the time of his death to kill him anyway. Mm-hmm. You put these things together and, oh, well, you're a racist if you say that. No, I'm just telling you the truth. If the truth is racist, then let's have the truth. You know, let's stop pretending that the truth is ugly. You know, when the truth is ugly, only a lie could be beautiful. Well, we've had enough beautiful lies for long enough. So what happened in 2020 was a foretaste of what I think we are going to see in the future, particularly if the left discovers that it will not retain power in perpetuity. And remember, the influx of all of these people that come here uninvited, unvetted, unknown. We're not talking about legal immigrants. You know, not all legal immigrants really want to be Americans either. We know that. But you have a better than 50-50 chance that if someone comes here legally and looks around, they want to be an American. That's helpful. But when you get millions of people in who are not here legally, they're not going to be Americans. And simply offering them citizenship isn't going to help. What it's going to do is dilute the meaning of your citizenship, the value of your citizenship, the importance of national identity and national cohesion. Those things will simply be swept away. So we're headed for trouble too. It's just that it struck France because France has a much higher proportion to deal with. 1 out of every 5 adults in France is a Muslim, Muslim Arab, Berber, African, whatever you want to call them from the Middle East or Africa. And there's not much that can be done, obviously, to satisfy the demands of these people, because the demands most of them seem to make is that the French abase themselves, abandon themselves, their identity, their history, and essentially submit to their demands to be whatever they are. This is not the way of the world. If it becomes that way, you go out of existence. Some people would argue the Roman Empire ended largely because of these kinds of things. I'm not an expert on the ancient world. I'm sure it contributed to it. But I think France is experiencing something that we're going to begin to see in Germany. We've already seen some of it in Sweden, in Denmark, Austria. The Poles have said no thank you. The Czechs have said no thank you. The Hungarians have said no thank you. Those countries have said, you're not going to come in here and test our cohesion with this nonsense. But the rest of the Europeans have largely embraced it. And I think once the globalist elites are thrown out of power, that's liable to change. Unless the Europeans collectively have decided, yes, we want to commit suicide and go out of existence. I don't think most Americans want that. But again, they haven't been heard from yet.
It's reminiscent of Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of Europe. And I think we see a lot of the same trends over here. And you mentioned that it is the globalist elite's agenda coming from the top. So I wonder what the motivation is here. What is the thinking that's driving all of this?
Well, we've already been over some of it. We talked about the Great Reset. And I think there is this sort of element that's a mixture of nihilism, Marxism, atheism, and globalism. You put them all together and you have this package that has decided the world will be converted into this amorphous mass of human beings that are all fungible, that can be employed as the great and powerful elites decide to employ them, use them, govern them. And that's what I perceive, and I think a lot of other people do as well. I don't want to live in that society. That society existed. It was the totalitarian state of Stalin. And that's not where I want to go. And I think, unfortunately, unless something is done, that's the slippery slope that you're on, because you suddenly decided to believe whatever the state says, as opposed to listening to yourself and your inner voice to tell you something very different. I give a speech once in a while privately that's called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And I talk about atheism, nihilism, Marxism, and globalism. And I try to define each of those, and not so much in an academic sense, but in the operational sense, what the consequences of those things are, especially when they become institutionalized, which looks as though it's happening to us, does it not?
I would say it does. I use the analogy of the Four Horsemen on my podcast as well. War, famine, disease, basically the trifecta of state collapse. And we all know what comes next. It's behold the pale horse, and he who sat on him was death. And if I could perhaps squeeze one more question out of you, I appreciate you being so generous with your time. But Afghanistan is something that's kind of near and dear to our hearts around here at Veterans for Freedom. I've been watching a lot of your stuff in preparation for this, but I haven't heard any commentary around this. So I'm very curious. It's hard to know what's going on there right now. We have some interpreters over there that we worked with through the war that haven't made their way out yet, and Canadians as well. So do you have any insight into what the current state of affairs is in Afghanistan?
I would think as a general principle for most of the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, particularly Afghanistan, Northwest India, Pakistan. Take your hand, shove it into a bucket of water. While your hand is in the water, you displace the water. Once you remove your hand, the water returns to its former state. Those are the realities in that part of the world. A foreign entity like the United States, Canada, the NATO alliance, any group of Europeans in particular, I would say, and Americans that go into these places are not going to permanently change anything. Certainly not in a way that necessarily benefits our interests. In fact, I think you're going to get the opposite reaction. I think we're seeing blowback now. We made matters much worse by being as intrusive as we were. There's a man whose name is Sir Richard Francis Burton, very famous British author and explorer and kind of James Bond in his own right in the 19th century. And he operated all over the British Empire. And he was very successful, much more successful, I would add, than British military power in bringing on side support, allies, and friends. Now, of course, the British had an advantage in one sense. They went to these places with the express purpose of extracting profit, capital, enriching themselves. They did not necessarily go in there with the goal of transforming these people into something they didn't want to become. They tried it for a short while in India. They ended up with a Sepoy rebellion, and they dropped that. We don't seem to understand that we exercise altruistic imperialism. In other words, we're imperialists, but we're very bad imperialists because we say, we're here to help you. We're here to pull you out of darkness, to enlighten you, to give you all these wonderful things. We discover after a while they don't want us. Nobody wants to be ruled by a foreign entity. Nobody wants policemen in their neighborhood who don't look like them, who don't speak like them, and don't understand them. And whether or not we approve of it is irrelevant. The simple fact of the matter is that we made a huge mistake when we went in there with the goal of anything other than expunging perhaps 300 to 400 people who were associated with Osama bin Laden and his gang that was implicated in the 9/11 disaster. That did not require armies. It did not require hundreds of thousands of men. It didn't require us to spend huge quantities of money. And frankly, if you'd gone to the Taliban and said, here's a pile of gold, you can have it if you give us Osama bin Laden and his friends, the probability is very high that they'd have sold him. And that's what everybody in the CIA who had spent time there told us. But we had another agenda, just as we had another agenda in Iraq. You know, whoever thought that you could dismantle the army, the state, and then rebuild it from scratch, make it into an Arab liberal democracy that, quote unquote, would be friendly to Israel? I mean, the chances of that happening are almost zero. And the worst part is that you use military power to do it. And the military power was the wrong instrument, has never been the right one for those kinds of things. And I don't think they were the right things to do to begin with. What was the goal in Iraq? You wanted to remove Saddam Hussein. Well, that's not hard to accomplish. That can be done too, without very much military power. But nobody would do it. So there was always another agenda. And that other agenda that I've been describing has done enormous damage to us. It's ruined our armed forces because we have lived in this sort of world I would call of the forward operating base. You know, you go on patrol, and unless you're blown up by an IED, you come back, you take a shower, you go to the mess hall, and then you go to sleep at night. It's not war. And that's the problem. We don't want to come to terms with that reality, but we have to right now because you're seeing an army in the field in Ukraine that's real. That Russian force is real. And they're tough. They're determined. They're not demoralized. Their generals are not all incompetent. The Ukrainians are very courageous and tough people. I grew up with them in North Philadelphia, some of the toughest human beings you'll ever meet in your life. But they're not going to prevail against overwhelming firepower. And they're being used as cannon fodder by evil people sitting in Washington, London, and other places. It's wrong, and it needs to stop.
So is the agenda here just the basic destruction of the country to do the rebuilding contracts for mega corporations?
Always follow the money, see where the money goes. Who are the people with the money? Who are the people who want the money? That makes a huge difference. There's no question of it. But I don't think it's all going to work out the way they would like it to work out because they won't sit down and talk with the Russians. And the first thing you've got to accept with the Russians is that whatever emerges from this war needs to be neutral. And the longer that you refuse to accept that, the more Ukrainians will die, the more destruction will be meted out to Ukraine. And the more likely that within a year there will be several 100,000 Russian troops on the border with Poland, which is rather odd since we said that was the very thing we were trying to prevent. In 1998, 99, when I was at SHAPE, people would say, well, where does Ukraine fit in? And everyone agreed. Ukraine is performing a very important mission. It keeps Russian military power at least 500 miles away from the border with NATO. That was it. Now, why can't it be neutral? Why does it have to become part of NATO? Why does it have to be, quote unquote, globalized? Especially since, let's be frank, this globalism is failing in Europe. It's failing here in the United States and in Canada. It's not going to last. The truckers you mentioned earlier in Canada are the ultimate victors. I know they don't think that's possible at this point, but they will be. There is such a thing as being on the wrong side of history. The Marxists did get one thing right. It was called the correlation of forces. That was Lenin's notion. He looked at all the forces because he understood there was more to it than just numbers and materiel. Well, those forces are against globalism.